You learn one new term in a meeting on Tuesday, and by Friday it feels like the entire company has been saying it for years. That is not a coincidence, and it is not because the word suddenly became popular. It is called the Baader-Meinhof phenomenon, also known as the frequency illusion, and once you understand what it actually is, you will start catching it happening to you in real time, which is a strange and slightly unsettling experience in itself. Here is the mechanism underneath it, and it comes down to two separate things working together. The first is selective attention. Once a word or an idea registers in your brain as meaningful, your brain quietly flags it as relevant and starts noticing it every time it appears, in places it was already appearing before you ever learned the term. The word was never rare. Your attention to it was. The second piece is confirmation bias. Once you start noticing the word, you remember every hit. Every time it shows up in a headline or a Slack message or a client call, and you do not register the dozens of times it does not appear, because a non-occurrence is not memorable. Nobody's brain logs the absence of a word. So you end up with a lopsided sample stacked entirely on one side. And that lopsided sample feels, from the inside, exactly like evidence of a real trend. You have almost certainly felt a version of this outside of work too, and it is worth naming because it makes the mechanism obvious, in a way that office examples sometimes do not. Someone decides to buy a particular model of car, does the research, signs the paperwork, drives it home. Within a week, that exact model seems to be parked on every street, in every parking lot, at every stoplight. The number of that model of car on the road did not change overnight, because one person bought one of them. What changed was a filter sitting somewhere in the visual system that used to treat that shape of car as background noise, and now treats it as a flagged object worth registering. Your brain cannot consciously process every detail in your field of view at all times, so it runs on a kind of relevance filter, deciding in the background what gets promoted to your conscious attention and what gets discarded before you ever notice it existed. Learning a new word, closing a new deal, hearing a new competitor name, all of these do the same thing that buying the car did. They flip a switch on the filter, and everything that was always there quietly floods back into view, dressed up as something new. Marketing teams see this constantly, almost as an occupational hazard. Launch a new buzzword internally, put it in a slide deck, use it in a company all hands, and within a few weeks, half the building swears it is industry standard vocabulary that everyone outside the building is already using too. It is not. It became visible because everyone inside the building got primed to notice it, not because the market moved. The word did not spread. The attention spread, which looks identical from the inside but means something completely different when you are trying to make a strategic decision based on it. And this matters far more than it sounds like it should, because the frequency illusion does not stay confined to trivia about vocabulary. It quietly contaminates real business judgment, and it does it in a way that feels like sharpened awareness, rather than a cognitive glitch, which is exactly what makes it dangerous. A leader hears one competitor casually mention an AI-first strategy in an earnings call or a conference panel. Then, over the next month, that leader starts noticing the phrase everywhere, in other companies' press releases, in job postings, in analyst notes, and panics that the whole market has quietly moved while their own company sat still. Usually, nothing changed in the market at all. What changed was that one salient data point rewired what the leader's attention was tuned to catch, and every subsequent mention, real but previously invisible to them, now gets counted as fresh confirmation of a trend that may not actually be accelerating. The same trap shows up inside performance reviews, and this is where it stops being an abstract cognitive science curiosity and starts actually shaping people's careers. Flag one employee for missing a deadline, and something clicks over in the manager's head. Suddenly, the manager notices every late task from that specific person, every slightly delayed handoff, every message sent a day later than expected. Meanwhile, identical lateness from someone else on the same team goes completely unnoticed, because that second person has not been tagged yet. The manager walks away from the quarter genuinely believing, with full sincerity, that the first employee has a consistent reliability problem, when what actually happened is that one early incident flipped a switch in their own attention, and then confirmation bias did the rest of the work quietly in the background. That is not sharper observation. That is confirmation bias wearing a data costume. And it is one of the more corrosive ways bias enters something that is supposed to be an objective process, because performance reviews feel procedural and evidence-based even when the underlying evidence was selectively collected from the very first day. Here is the part that catches most people off guard, and it is the part that should genuinely change how you treat your own sense of certainty going forward. This bias does not feel like a bias while it is happening. It feels like pattern recognition. It feels like your instincts finally catching up to something real, like you have become more perceptive rather than less accurate. That is exactly what makes it so hard to self-correct in the moment, because the emotional signal accompanying a frequency illusion is indistinguishable from the inside from the emotional signal accompanying a genuinely sharp observation. Your brain does not send you a little flag saying, "Caution, this pattern might be manufactured by your own attention." It just feels like insight every single time, whether the underlying trend is real or entirely a byproduct of one meeting that happened to plant a word in your head. It also helps to notice how quickly this loop resolves once it has run its course, because that gives you a rough sense of how much of any given surge is attention rather than substance. Most frequency illusions burn out within a matter of weeks, once the novelty of the word wears off and it stops feeling like a discovery. A genuine shift in the market, by contrast, tends to keep showing up in the boring, unglamorous numbers long after it has stopped being interesting to talk about in meetings. If a term or a pattern you noticed a month ago has already faded from conversation without ever showing up in an actual metric, that is a reasonably strong sign it was never really a trend to begin with, just a spotlight your own attention was holding for a little while before it got bored and moved on to something else. There is a reason this particular illusion has such a memorable, slightly odd name, by the way. It comes from an early internet forum story. Someone mentioned the German militant group Baader-Meinhof once, in passing, and then the poster claimed to suddenly hear the name everywhere for weeks afterward. The story spread. Other people recognized the same pattern in their own lives, and the informal name stuck long before researchers gave it the more clinical label, frequency illusion, which describes the mechanism rather than the anecdote. Both names point at the same underlying process, one selective attention loop feeding a confirmation bias loop running quietly under the surface of something that feels like objective observation. But here is the part nobody expects, and it makes everything you just heard quite a bit worse. There is a modern wrinkle that makes the frequency illusion sharper today than it would have been a generation ago. Every major social feed and recommendation system is built to show you more of whatever you already stopped to engage with. Pause on one post mentioning a term, even briefly, even just to read the first line, and the system quietly registers that as a signal and starts serving you more of the same. That means the frequency illusion is no longer just a trick your own attention plays on you internally. It is now getting actively reinforced by software that is specifically engineered to amplify whatever you already noticed, which turns a private cognitive quirk into something closer to a feedback loop, with a machine on the other end of it, cheerfully supplying more evidence for a trend that may have started as a single, unremarkable mention. This is worth pausing on, because there is a deeper irony buried in how this bias operates specifically inside organizations that pride themselves on being data-driven. A team that trusts its own gut instincts to notice patterns is actually more exposed to this illusion, not less, because gut instinct is precisely the channel this bias travels through. The more confident you are in your own perceptiveness, the more willing you are to act on a pattern you have merely noticed rather than one you have actually measured. Ironically, the people most likely to say, "I have a good nose for trends," are often the ones least likely to double-check whether the trend they are smelling is really out there in the world or just freshly installed in their own head. So what do you actually do with this? Because noticing the bias exists is only half the fix, and half fixes are exactly the kind of thing that quietly erodes trust in decisions later. The practical move is simple to state and slightly uncomfortable to practice consistently. When you suddenly notice a pattern everywhere, the very first question worth asking, before you act on it, is whether the world changed or your attention changed. That is a genuinely different question from asking whether the pattern is true, because the pattern might be perfectly true as an observation and still be completely misleading as a signal about direction or magnitude. 10 real sightings of a buzzword prove the word exists. They do not prove the market moved. And they definitely do not prove it moved this month, specifically because of your competitor's earnings call. This same filter effect shows up in hiring conversations too, in a way that is easy to miss until you go looking for it. A hiring manager sits through one candidate who name drops a particular framework or methodology in an interview. For the next several weeks, that same manager starts hearing the term from other candidates, from recruiters, from LinkedIn posts, and quietly concludes that the entire talent market has shifted toward requiring that specific skill. Sometimes that is true. Often it is simply that the manager's own filter got recalibrated by one conversation, and candidates who mentioned the term before, without it registering, are now the ones getting noticed, while candidates who never mention it at all are not being compared fairly against a baseline that has quietly moved. A hiring bar that shifts because of one salient interview rather than because of an actual analysis of what the role needs, is not a stronger bar. It is a noisier one dressed up to look like standards rising. The second move is to go check hard numbers before reacting, and to treat that step as non-negotiable rather than optional once your gut has already made up its mind. Sales data, competitor filings, actual project timestamps pulled from whatever system tracks them, not a mental tally built from memory. Real numbers do not care how vivid last Tuesday's meeting felt. They are not affected by which word happened to catch your ear first. If the competitor's supposed AI-first pivot shows up in their hiring data, their public roadmap, and their actual product releases, that is a real signal worth responding to. If it only shows up in the fact that you, personally, have heard the phrase 4 times this month, that is not a market signal. That is a spotlight sitting on your own head. And spotlights do not tell you anything about what is happening in the dark parts of the room. The same discipline applies directly to how you run performance reviews, and it is worth building into an actual process rather than trusting yourself to remember it in the moment, because in the moment is exactly when this bias is strongest. Before flagging a pattern in someone's work, pull the actual record for the whole team, not just the person who happens to be top of mind. Compare deadline timestamps across everyone on the roster, not just the one name your attention has been quietly tracking since the incident that first caught your eye. If the pattern holds up across a full, symmetric comparison, it is real, and you should act on it. If it only holds up for the one person you already noticed, you have not found a performance problem. You have found your own attention loop, and mistaking that for a personnel issue is exactly the kind of error that quietly damages trust and morale without anyone being able to point to what went wrong. My own read on this, after watching it play out in enough meetings, is that the frequency illusion is more dangerous in confident, experienced managers than in nervous, junior ones, precisely because confidence makes people skip the verification step. A junior manager who is unsure of themselves tends to double-check a pattern before acting on it, almost out of anxiety. A senior manager who trusts their instincts, earned over years of genuinely good calls, is far more likely to treat a freshly noticed pattern as settled fact and move straight to action, skipping the exact step that would have told them whether the pattern was real or manufactured by their own head. Experience is supposed to make judgment more reliable. On this particular bias, it can just as easily make it faster to be wrong. There is one more layer to this worth naming plainly, because it is the genuinely useful takeaway buried underneath all the psychology. A trend that feels sudden and obvious is not more trustworthy than a trend that emerges slowly and quietly. If anything, it deserves more scrutiny, not less, because sudden obviousness is exactly the signature of an attention effect rather than a real shift in the underlying data. Real market movements tend to show up gradually across multiple independent measures at once. Sales, hiring, competitor filings, customer behavior, all drifting in the same direction over weeks or months. Attention effects show up as a single word or idea that feels like it exploded overnight because one meeting flipped a switch in your own head. Learn to tell the two apart, and you will save yourself from chasing phantom trends, from misjudging a colleague's reliability based on a lopsided sample of your own noticing, and from mistaking the sound of your own attention for the sound of the market actually changing underneath you. So the next time a word or a pattern suddenly feels like it is everywhere, pause before you act on that feeling. Because that feeling of suddenness is the tell, not the proof, and go ahead and tap follow so the next one lands automatically. See you in a week.